So, getting to some questions from today's audience. Jeffrey, this first one dropped in during your segment. Ladies, if you want to chime in as well, you're more than welcome to. But Jeffrey, if price is determined by supply and demand, could one ever have instances of price, or how could you ever have an instance of price gouging when you look at supply and demand?
Well, I think that's a very insightful question. And there are certainly some economists out there who would say you can't have instances of price gouging, that the price is an indicator of what people are willing to pay. And if no one is willing to pay an inflated price, then that price isn't a real price. And so a great example of this is in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And there were a number of individuals or firms sued for selling generators at too high of a price. And without getting into the ethics or the morality of that situation, an economist might say that price is a rationing mechanism. It simply ensures that the good or service at issue goes to the people who are most willing to pay for it. And so you could think of a major grocery store or think of a butcher shop that might have thousands of dollars of meat in their refrigerator cases. And being able to acquire a generator could save them thousands or tens of thousands of dollars by not having that meat spoil, versus someone that might just have a refrigerator of meat at home and their groceries in the refrigerator might be worth $100 or a couple $100. Obviously, the butcher shop or the grocery store has a much higher value or much higher need for the generator and would be willing to pay that much more for the generator than the person sitting at home. And so from a moral or ethical perspective, one might argue both the homeowner and the butcher shop owner should have the equal ability to obtain the generator. But an economist would say increasing price is the mechanism by ensure that the person who values the generator most will get it. So it's a tough question that an economist and a lawyer and an ethicist all might answer that a bit differently.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Another question that dropped in was relating to the definition of the product market. Why is it so important for an economist to properly define the product market itself?
Well, this gets back to something I mentioned in my presentation. So when I discussed the carbonated beverage industry, I was talking about all the different products that might compete against Coke or Pepsi or cola generally. And so for those of you who practice in this space, it should come as no surprise that the more products you add to a product market, the more potential competitors there are, or the more opportunities there are to discipline price of the merging entity. So if Coke and Pepsi were the only two manufacturers capable of disciplining each other's price or acting as a constraint on each other's prices, then allowing them to merge would allow prices almost undoubtedly to increase. But if there are other carbonated beverages that are a reasonable substitute for Coke and Pepsi, then if Coke and Pepsi merged and tried to raise prices beyond some amount, those other competitors would provide a disciplining effect that at some point so many consumers might switch to Dr. Pepper or root beer or bottled water that the price increase that the merged Coke and Pepsi entities were trying to put through simply couldn't stick.
Thank you so much. Another quick question that we got for yourself, Jeffrey, and it was related to the common impact. What sort of analyses would an economist conduct to best analyze common impacts? I think it's asking for a little bit of best practice there. So the sorts of analysis that you would undertake as an economist conducting analysis into common impacts.
Right. So, this is getting back to the point of my presentation when I was talking about that economists are well equipped to assemble models of pricing. And so to be a little bit more specific here, economists have at their disposal a tool known as regression analysis. And that is simply a fancy word for determining how some sort of variable or statistic of interest, such as price, relates to other possible explanatory variables. So when one thinks about price, I often teach that it is helpful to think about what are the supply and demand factors affecting price. And for anyone who listened to my presentation, that explanation shouldn't come as a surprise. And so economists will often do a lot of research to understand what are the factors affecting price, and then they will set up a statistical model to estimate how much those factors are impacting the price at issue. And then to the extent that there is any price variation left unexplained, economists might be able to attribute that to the conduct at issue, say the alleged price fixing or the alleged rebating scheme, for instance. And that by looking at what portion of price movements may be attributable to the challenged conduct, then economists can start analyzing issues related to possible adverse impact, or perhaps more specifically, issues related to damages and how much plaintiffs might be due in response to the challenged conduct.
Thank you so much. A quick follow-up question on that point. You mentioned regression analysis. Is that the gold standard when it comes to analysis, or would it really depend on the product, the marketplace itself, or the specialist area of that product, which analysis you would look to use, or would it be looking at regression analysis being the gold standard? Apologies if I may have butchered that question, but I think I may have got the gist. But let me know if you need me to repeat that, Jeffrey.
No, that makes perfect sense, and that's a really good follow-up. I guess part of the issue comes down to what is meant by gold standard. I think regression analysis is an incredibly powerful tool that, when conducted appropriately, gives very robust results. I wouldn't go so far as to say that in any given instance, an economist needs to conduct a regression analysis. Oftentimes, the data may simply not be available to conduct a regression analysis. Or sometimes there may be a simpler solution than conducting a regression analysis. That ultimately, whatever an economist puts forward as an expert opinion, there is a chance that that goes in front of a judge or a jury of lay people who may not have the first idea of statistics. And so I do think regression analysis is a great tool for economists to use, but there are certainly instances where it may not be either possible or advisable to go down that path.
Thank you so much. Allison, a quick question here that dropped in during your segment, but Jeffrey, again, if you've got any insight, would love to hear it too. But Allison, can a competitor collaboration entered into or during the pandemic continue after the national emergency subsides?
Depends. As I mentioned, this is a very fact-specific analysis to the industry, and so it really depends on what the industry looks like now after the national emergency has subsided, and if there have been changes that make it permissible. You're starting with the idea that the collaboration was entered into because of some exigency of the pandemic, because the supply chain was disrupted, or some other effect like that. It might not make sense going forward, and might look more like competitors trying to collude. But again, there are many examples of horizontal relationships that are pro-competitive, and so it very well could continue on with no competition risk.
Thank you so much. Another question here, Allison, this is for yourself. And do you think there will be any impact on the change of market share during the pandemic? And would any impact on that market share affect the rule of reason analysis?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a similar issue. We use market shares generally just as a indicator or proxy for market power. And of course, the market power is what allows collaborating competitors to actually causes anti-competitive effects in the market. So if your market shares are changing, after the economy has return to a quote unquote normal stage, again, the entire market structure could look very different. And, those market shares might be very different from what they were at the beginning of the pandemic period. And so consequently, the rule of reason may look different if the anti-competitive effect of your collaboration has changed